The night is gentle over the Nile. A warm breeze moves across the water like a quiet breath, and the lamps of Alexandria flicker in the distance, glowing like fallen stars resting along the shore. The world has gone still, but history has not. It waits, silent, patient, inside the walls of palaces and temples, beneath the sand, and in the memory of those who shaped empires. Tonight, we travel back to a world where gods walked beside rulers, where a single river fed millions, and where one woman stood at the center of it all, intelligent, fearless, and endlessly underestimated. Cleopatra, not the cartoon villain Rome painted, not the seductress from cheap Hollywood posters, but the last pharaoh of Egypt, a strategist, a linguist, a diplomat, a survivor. Before her story became legend, it was simply life. And tonight, we will walk through it slowly, gently, step by step, as if we are drifting along the Nile at night. No battles crashing into our ears, no shouting senators, only soft memory, layered with moonlight and the quiet truth beneath centuries of propaganda. As we move through Cleopatra's world, let the day fall away. Let the past unfold like papyrus in torchlight. And if your eyes grow heavy as the story deepens, that's perfectly fine. History will keep watch for you. So settle in, let the river carry you, and let us begin at the heart of a kingdom unlike any other. Chapter 1. The world she inherited. Long before Cleopatra took the throne, Egypt was already ancient. By her birth, the pyramids of Giza were older to her than the Roman Empire is to us today. Imagine that for a moment, living in a land where even the ruins were ruins. Yet Egypt was not a relic. It was alive. It pulsed with grain, gold, gods, and knowledge. At its heart stood Alexandria, a city carved by ambition. Built by Alexander the Great, it rose from the coastline like a dream of marble and light. By Cleopatra's time, it was the capital of intellect, home to the great library, the museum, philosophers, engineers, astronomers, poets. If a thought was worth having, someone in Alexandria was having it, and writing it down on scrolls guarded like treasure. Picture it at dusk, the lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, casting its beam across the sea, guiding ships from every corner of the Mediterranean. Greek merchants bargaining in the streets, Egyptian priests carrying offerings into temples older than memory, sailors from Africa, scholars from Asia, spices from India, silk from China. Egypt was the center of the map, whether the map wanted to admit it or not. And ruling over this fusion of cultures, not native Egyptians, but Greeks. The Ptolemaic dynasty, Cleopatra's family, were descendants of Ptolemy Thrar, one of Alexander's generals. They ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years. And if you're thinking, wow, must have been stable, please remember, this is an ancient royal family, which means they married their siblings, they plotted in shadows, they smiled at dinner and poisoned dessert. The Ptolemies were basically a royal soap opera with better architecture. But they were clever. They knew to survive in Egypt, you had to wear 2 crowns. The Greek crown, to rule the court, the armies, the scholars, and the Egyptian crown, to satisfy the temples, the people, and the gods. Rule with logic and ritual, taxes and festivals, scrolls and statues. It was a balancing act performed on a knife's edge, and Cleopatra would become its greatest performer. Though born in a palace of marble, she was not sheltered. From childhood, she saw how easily power slipped through fingers. She watched family members rise and fall, sometimes in the same week. She learned early that in her world, survival depended on knowing when to speak, when to listen, and when to disappear quietly through a side door. Egypt itself was both powerful and vulnerable. Its wealth was unmatched, grain that could feed nations, trade routes touching 3 continents, but that wealth made it a magnet for Roman friendship. And by friendship, I mean control. And by control, I mean nice kingdom. Would be a shame if someone annexed it. Rome was growing stronger each year, expanding like a tide, and every tide eventually reaches every shore. As Cleopatra grew, the shadow of Rome stretched over the Mediterranean. Senators debated how to use Egypt. Generals dreamed of owning it. And deep down, every Ptolemy knew. One day, Rome would come knocking. But Cleopatra would be different. Unlike her siblings, she didn't just learn Greek. She learned Egyptian, the language of the people and the priests. She studied philosophy, economics, politics, religion, mathematics. She could recite poetry and calculate taxes without breaking eye contact. Rome trained generals. Egypt trained god-kings. Cleopatra trained herself to be both. Even as a child, she knew her world was fragile. She felt the cracks in the dynasty, the pressure of Rome, the weight of tradition, and the possibility of change. And somewhere within the palace walls, beneath painted ceilings, and between columns of cool stone, she made a decision. She would not be a decoration. She would not be a pawn. She would be the one holding the pieces. Before the wars, before the legends, before the myths, there was this moment. A young girl in the palace, listening to the quiet of the night, realizing the world was shifting, and she was going to shift with it. Chapter 2. A princess in a palace of shadows. Before Cleopatra was a queen, she was a daughter in a palace where silence was never just silence, it was strategy. In the marble halls of Alexandria's royal quarters, words were more dangerous than swords, and a calm smile could hide 10 different plots. The palace itself was stunning. Gleaming courtyards, pools reflecting the sky, columns painted with gold and lapis. But behind the beauty, tension lived in every corner. Servants walked quietly. Guards pretended not to listen. And the walls, if they could talk, would mostly scream. Cleopatra grew up surrounded by siblings who were also rivals, advisors who pretended to care, and tutors who taught more than just reading and writing. They taught survival, and she paid attention. While other royal children spent their days being pampered, Cleopatra studied like the kingdom depended on it. Because one day, it might. She learned philosophy from Greek scholars. She learned diplomacy from watching her father beg Rome for help. She learned ritual from Egyptian priests in ancient temples, where the air smelled like incense and eternity. Most rulers learned how to command. Cleopatra learned how to understand. She realized people were predictable. The proud want flattery. The fearful want safety. The greedy want opportunity. And the truly dangerous, they want everything. Even as a young teenager, Cleopatra could walk into a room and feel exactly which personalities were clashing like unsheathed daggers. She could sense tension the way others sensed temperature. And yet, there were quiet moments too. Imagine this. Late night in the palace, most torches extinguished, only moonlight spilling through colonnades, the city beyond the walls breathing softly in the dark. Sometimes, Cleopatra would slip onto a balcony and just listen to the wind, to the distant waves against the harbor, to the idea of Egypt itself. If you stood beside her, you might not hear anything at all, but she was listening to responsibility, already knocking. Because even then she knew, one day, all of this will be mine to protect. But protecting Egypt meant protecting it from more than jealous siblings. There was a much larger predator circling in the distance, wearing a red cloak and Roman sandals. Rome, the quiet threat. To understand Cleopatra, you have to understand Rome at this time. It claimed to be a republic, it acted like a corporation, and it behaved like a hungry lion that just discovered delivery service. Rome wanted 3 things from Egypt: grain, to feed its people; gold, to fund its wars; obedience, because Rome hated when others had nice things. Egypt was wealthy, powerful, and strategically placed, which meant Rome smiled politely while sharpening its knives. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy Thutun, saw the danger. So he did what any financially irresponsible royal would do. He took massive loans from Rome to secure their friendship. Translation: please don't invade us. Here's money. Spoiler: Rome happily took the money and still treated Egypt like a future vacation home. Cleopatra watched all of this and learned a critical lesson. Debt to Rome is just conquest on a payment plan. She understood something her predecessors didn't. If Egypt was going to survive, it needed more than wealth. It needed a ruler who could outthink Rome. Cleopatra, the student of everything. While her siblings indulged in luxury, Cleopatra trained like a weapon. She learned 7 languages, including Egyptian, which most of her Greek ancestors didn't even bother to speak. She studied law, economics, mathematics, philosophy, history. She learned religious rituals because in Egypt, a ruler wasn't just a politician. They were the link to the gods. She even learned battle tactics and naval logistics because apparently sleep was optional. She was not preparing to be royalty. She was preparing to be essential. Most queens were taught how to stand still and look divine. Cleopatra was taught how to think, negotiate, persuade, and command. And she was watching, always watching. She saw how the priests responded to generosity, how merchants responded to opportunity, how soldiers responded to loyalty, how Romans responded to weakness. She understood that true power wasn't yelling orders. It was making people want to follow you. The family chaos. Of course, even while she was preparing to govern an empire, she still had to survive one thing: her family. Ptolemaic tradition was, let's call it, aggressively dysfunctional. Siblings married each other, because why not ruin both family roles at once? Assassinations were normal Tuesday activities. Every child was either a future ruler or a future threat. It was the kind of environment where you didn't blow out your birthday candles. You just hoped nobody blew out you. In this chaos, Cleopatra developed her most powerful skill, reading people instantly. One glance could tell her who was lying, who was scared, who was plotting, who could be useful. She learned to lower her voice instead of raising it, to ask questions instead of making threats, to make allies who believed in her, not just feared her. And maybe that's why people followed her so fiercely later. Because from a young age, Cleopatra understood something profound. It's easy to take power. It's harder to deserve it. A quiet strength. Some nights, when the palace was calm, she would walk past pillars carved with hieroglyphics thousands of years old. She would trace the symbols with her fingertips, feeling the weight of the past. Pharaohs had ruled before her. God-kings, warriors, builders of monuments touching the sky. Would she join them or be forgotten? Standing there, in the glow of the moon, she likely didn't know how. But she knew this. She was meant for more than survival. She was meant to shape history. And history was getting very close, because in the distance, beyond the palace, beyond the desert, beyond the sea, Rome was moving, and soon it would collide with Cleopatra. But Egypt had no idea that the young girl in the moonlight was about to become the last great defender of a 3,000-year-old civilization, and she was almost ready. Chapter 3. The moment she stepped forward, power in Egypt didn't arrive with fanfare. It crept in quietly, usually after someone else died. When Cleopatra was around 18, her father, Ptolemy III, passed away. And as with every Ptolemaic instruction manual, his will included two things. Cleopatra would rule, with her younger brother, Ptolemy III, as co-ruler. Ah, yes, the classic, share the throne with a child who can't even grow a proper beard. What could possibly go wrong? On paper, they were equals. In reality, Cleopatra was the ruler, and she wasn't subtle about it. She put her name first on official documents, appeared alone on coinage, spoke directly to ambassadors without her brother present, acted like a sole monarch, because she basically was. And surprisingly, the people didn't mind. Why? Because Cleopatra did something rare for a royal. She actually showed up for Egypt. While previous rulers hid in luxury, Cleopatra met with priests in temple courtyards, talked to local leaders, walked among her people, understood the needs of farmers, traders, and scholars. She wasn't just the queen, she was their queen. And then the palace officials panicked, because a smart, confident, popular woman in power, obviously a threat. History, making powerful men insecure for 5,000 years. The coup nobody asked for the advisors, mostly older male regents, decided Cleopatra was inconveniently competent. So they backed her brother, Ptolemy III, who was about 12 and could be easily controlled. One morning, Cleopatra woke up and discovered the government had politely uninvited her from ruling. Translation: they kicked her out. No trial, no warning. Just, "Hi Cleopatra, quick update, you're no longer queen. Have a nice life." Most rulers in her position would flee or beg. Cleopatra did neither. She strategized. She gathered loyal supporters. She raised an army in the east, near Syria. She prepared to fight for her throne. Meanwhile, her brother's advisors threw a massive celebration in Alexandria, confident they had won. They had no idea they were about to invite a much bigger problem. Rome enters the chat far away. In the Roman world, chaos was exploding. Julius Caesar defeated Pompey the Great in a civil war. Pompey fled, searching for safety. And where did he run? Egypt. Bad idea. The advisors of Ptolemy III saw an opportunity. If we kill Pompey and present his head to Caesar as a gift, Caesar will love us. This is the ancient version of trying to impress someone by throwing their friend off a bridge. They executed Pompey as soon as he landed, then proudly offered his severed head to Caesar like a birthday present. Caesar's reaction? Not joy, not gratitude, disgust. Even by Roman standards, this was low. And Caesar, a man with an ego the size of a small moon, did not appreciate losing the chance to make his own dramatic execution. So Caesar went to Alexandria, angry, armed, and absolutely ready to rearrange Egypt's leadership. Ptolemy III panicked. His advisors panicked. Cleopatra? She saw opportunity. Cleopatra's legendary entrance, with her brother controlling the palace and blocking her return, Cleopatra had to find a way inside the heavily guarded royal compound without being seen. So she did the most Cleopatra thing possible. She did not sneak in like a criminal. She delivered herself like a gift. According to legend, she was rolled inside a carpet or bedding sack and smuggled straight into Caesar's private chambers. Imagine being the soldier carrying that bundle. Why is this rug so queen-shaped? Whether it was a carpet, a sack, or just stealthy timing, Cleopatra walked into Caesar's presence when no one else could. And Caesar, the most powerful man in the world, met a woman who spoke his language, matched his intelligence, understood politics, and didn't tremble in his presence. He expected fear. She offered alliances. He expected excuses. She offered solutions. He expected beauty. She offered strategy. And just like that, the game changed. The siege begins. Caesar declared that Cleopatra should be restored as co-ruler. Ptolemy, Tethion's advisors, responded with the classic diplomatic move of the era. They attacked Caesar. Yes, they attacked Rome's greatest general in their own capital, with his army already inside the walls. Smart? No. Inevitable? Absolutely. The city erupted into conflict. Streets turned into battlegrounds. The harbor filled with fire and warships. And in the middle of it all, Cleopatra stayed calm. While others panicked, she met with Caesar, planned strategies, negotiated with factions, and kept her focus on one goal: take back Egypt. And as the smoke rose over Alexandria and the world watched the chaos unfold, a new legend was being born. Not of a temptress, not of a victim, but of a ruler who could stand beside the most powerful men in history and not bow. Chapter 4. Cleopatra and Caesar. Alliance in the ashes. Alexandria burned. Not the whole city, but enough to make the sky glow red at night, like the gods had lit a signal fire above Egypt. Roman soldiers clashed with Egyptian forces in the streets, ships blazed in the harbor, and the palace echoed with shouting and steel. And in the center of this storm, two people stood almost unnervingly calm. Julius Caesar, Rome's most brilliant general. Cleopatra, Egypt's most underestimated woman. They weren't just surviving the chaos, they were shaping it. The siege of Alexandria, Ptolemy, Tethys' forces surrounded the palace where Caesar and Cleopatra held their ground. For months, fighting smoldered like a slow-burning fuse. Food grew scarce, morale thinned, tension sharpened. But Cleopatra never lost composure. While generals barked orders, she walked the halls with quiet purpose. She studied maps with Caesar. She advised on Egyptian politics, troop loyalty, local resources. And Caesar listened. Let's pause on that. Roman generals did not take advice from 21-year-old foreign queens. Yet here he was, relying on her insight. Why? Because she wasn't just intelligent. She was deeply strategic. She understood Egypt better than any advisor, and she could explain it with ruthless clarity. Caesar brought legions. Cleopatra brought the blueprint. Together they formed something rare, a political partnership where both sides were actually useful. A city of fire and quiet. While battles raged outside, inside the palace was a strangely calm world of candlelight and echoing marble corridors. The thick stone walls muffled the sound of war, turning distant screams into whispers, making everything feel like a dream. Sometimes, at night, Cleopatra would walk along the balcony, overlooking the dark sea. The torchlight flickered on her robes as the wind from the harbor carried traces of salt and smoke. If you stood with her, You'd see the faint glow of fires in the distance, but also the moonlight shimmering on the water. War and beauty existing side by side. It was in these moments she made her most important decisions, not with panic, but with precision. Cleopatra didn't react emotionally to danger. She studied it, and each passing day, she and Caesar tightened their grip on the palace, gathering loyalists, making plans, waiting for the perfect moment to strike back. The turning point. Reinforcements finally arrived, from Rome, loyal to Caesar. With fresh troops and Cleopatra's knowledge of the terrain, they broke the siege. In the chaos of retreat, Ptolemy III tried to flee across the Nile and drowned. Not exactly the heroic end his propaganda promised. A little embarrassing, honestly. With him gone, the resistance collapsed. The war ended, not with a victory parade, but with a quiet, inevitable shift in power. And in the silence that followed, Cleopatra stepped forward. The throne restored Caesar, declared Cleopatra the rightful ruler of Egypt. But because Egyptian tradition demanded a co-ruler, she was paired with another younger brother, Ptolemy IV. Yes, another brother. Yes, also married to her. No, she did not ask for this feature. To the public, dual monarchy. In reality, Cleopatra ruled alone. Caesar stayed in Egypt for a time, and Alexandria transformed from a war zone back into a glittering capital, but different than before. Because now, its queen walked with a new confidence. She had faced betrayal, she had faced invasion, she had faced Rome, and she had survived them all. More than survived, she had won. The personal and the strategic. Let's address the obvious. Yes, Cleopatra and Caesar became lovers. But let's kill the lazy myth. This wasn't some dramatic seduction scene with rose petals and flutes playing in the background. This was political gravity. Two hyper-intelligent, high-status leaders working closely under extreme pressure, bonding through strategy, victory, and shared ambition. If anything, Cleopatra seduced Caesar with competence. And Caesar? He wasn't exactly a monk. Roman historians joked he conquered more bedrooms than battlefields. So when two powerhouses like this connected, it made sense. But it was never just romance. It was an alliance. Why Cleopatra chose Caesar? She needed Roman recognition, legitimacy, military protection, economic stability, time to rebuild Egypt, and someone Rome actually feared Caesar provided all of it. Why did he choose her? Because she reinforced his presence in the East, secured Rome's grain, backed him financially. Yes, she funded him, offered geopolitical leverage, and inconveniently for his enemies. She was smarter than half the Roman Senate. They weren't in love with each other's beauty. They were in love with each other's minds. The child that shook Rome. Not long after, Cleopatra gave birth to a son, Ptolemy IV, Philometor Caesar. Yes, the name is a paragraph. Ancient royalty loved long names. But most people called him something shorter, Caesarion. Little Caesar. And that was political dynamite. Because if Caesar acknowledged this child, it meant Cleopatra had produced an heir to Rome and Egypt combined. That was more than romance. That was destiny, or danger, depending on who you asked. As the Nile flowed quietly under the moonlight, and the palace glowed with soft lantern light, Cleopatra, now a mother and a queen, stood on the edge of a new era. But Rome had changed, and Caesar was about to take Cleopatra into the heart of the beast, to Rome itself, where admiration would turn into scandal, and scandal would turn into assassination. When Cleopatra arrived in Rome, she didn't sneak in quietly. She arrived the way she did everything, like a statement the universe was required to notice. Picture it: a fleet of Egyptian ships gliding into the Tiber, sails painted crimson and gold, sunlight flashing off bronze. Word spread faster than any official proclamation. The Queen of Egypt is here. Caesar greeted her personally, which, politically speaking, was the Roman version of shouting, "Yes, I'm in a relationship, and no, it's not complicated." Rome reacts. The Roman elite didn't handle this well. They tolerated Caesar's arrogance. They'd survived his wars. They'd even looked the other way when he crowned himself dictator for life. But this was scandal with eyeliner. Cleopatra's arrival broke every social expectation Rome held sacred. A foreign monarch, a woman, beautiful, educated, and not remotely apologetic about either. She lived openly in Caesar's villa across the Tiber, technically not in Rome, but close enough to scandalize anyone with a toga and an opinion. She hosted dinners. Scholars, poets, and statesmen came to meet her, half out of curiosity, half out of fear of missing something historic. She spoke to them fluently: Greek, Latin, Egyptian, shifting language as smoothly as breathing. She didn't act like a guest. She acted like an equal. Rome didn't know whether to bow or panic. Cleopatra's image to the Roman public: Cleopatra was mesmerizing and terrifying in equal measure. They had never seen anyone like her, not just her beauty. Roman writers couldn't shut up about it. But her composure. She carried herself like someone who knew the difference between flattery and respect, and demanded the latter. Her presence forced Rome to confront its own insecurities. A civilization that claimed to rule the world was suddenly uneasy about one woman's confidence. She was everything they said women shouldn't be: articulate, intelligent, strategic, and immune to Roman ego. And the sarcasm of it all? Rome had spent decades stealing the wealth of Egypt. And now Egypt had sent its most valuable treasure to sit at Caesar's side. The gift that started a war of symbols. During Cleopatra's stay, Caesar dedicated a new statue in the Temple of Venus Genetrix, the goddess he claimed as his ancestor. Beside it, he placed another statue of Cleopatra, portrayed as Isis, goddess of motherhood and magic. To Romans, this was basically sacrilege and PR suicide combined. A living foreign queen, honored as a goddess in Rome's most sacred temple? They might as well have hung a sign reading, "Caesar no longer cares what you think." But to Cleopatra, this was genius. It tied her image to divinity in both cultures. In Egypt, she was seen as Isis reborn. In Rome, she became something between myth and scandal, the ultimate form of visibility. Caesarion and legacy. Cleopatra's son, Caesarion, was the quiet storm behind all of this. Rome whispered. Was he really Caesar's child? Caesar never officially acknowledged him, but he never denied it either, which, in politics, is the same as shouting it from the rooftops. Cleopatra didn't push the matter publicly. She didn't need to. She simply existed beside Caesar with her son, a living symbol that the blood of two empires had mixed. And Rome couldn't stand it. The irony of power. Caesar was at the height of his glory. He had conquered Gaul, defeated Pompey, rewritten laws, reformed calendars. The man even added days to the year, literally more time, as if eternity was something he could edit. But for all his control, he couldn't control how people felt about Cleopatra. To the Romans, she embodied every fear they had of losing their own dominance. To the women of Rome, she was the nightmare they secretly admired. proof that intelligence could dethrone armies. The end of the alliance. In early 44 BCE, Cleopatra was still in Rome when Caesar was assassinated. The Ides of March, knives in the Senate, marble floors stained red, whispers rising like smoke. When news reached Cleopatra, she stayed composed. No wailing, no theatrics, just silence. Cold, strategic silence. Because she understood something the conspirators didn't. You can kill a man, but not his influence. She gathered her son, her servants, and her fleet. Without fanfare, she slipped out of Rome, back across the Mediterranean, back to Egypt, back to her throne. Aftermath. Rome descended into chaos. Mark Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus carved the Republic into 3 pieces like greedy heirs fighting over an inheritance. Civil wars, betrayals, shifting alliances. It was all very Roman. Cleopatra watched it unfold from Alexandria, patient, cautious, weighing her next move. She had loved a Roman once, but this time she would not fall into Rome's orbit. She would pull Rome into hers. And that is where destiny and a certain charming general named Mark Antony enters the story. Chapter 6. Cleopatra and Mark Antony. The art of entrance. Rome was on fire again. Not literally this time, emotionally, politically, morally, which for Rome was basically a normal Monday. After Caesar's death, the Republic tore itself apart. 2 men rose above the chaos. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal general, charismatic, fearless, brilliant in battle, allergic to paperwork. Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, young, quiet, patient, terrifying beneath the surface. They formed a temporary alliance to defeat Caesar's killers. But once the war was won, one truth hovered over Rome like smoke. Only one of them could rule the future. Antony took the east, Octavian took the west, and in the east was Cleopatra. Antony summons the queen. In 41 BCE, Antony summoned Cleopatra to the city of Tarsus to explain herself. He had heard rumors. Did she support Caesar's assassins? Did she fund his enemies? Was she loyal to Rome or to herself? Antony expected her to arrive nervous, humble, maybe even begging. Cleopatra heard the summons and smiled. This was not something she would attend. This was something she would own. The most legendary arrival in antiquity. Let's set the scene. The Cydnus River, warm breeze, crowds lining the banks, Roman soldiers watching impatiently. And then she appears. Cleopatra arrives on a magnificent barge, sails dyed purple, the color of royalty, insanely expensive. Silver oars flashing in the sun. Perfume filling the air so richly that people said you could smell her before you saw her gold everywhere. Draped fabrics, jewels, torches, fresh flowers, music. She was dressed as Isis, goddess of love and power, not seducing Antony, overwhelming him. She didn't meet him in his audience chamber. She made him come to her ship. Antony, a man who commanded legions, walked down to her like an invited guest. This wasn't flirting. This was diplomacy, performed as theater. B-roll, soft, slow, dreamlike. Silken sails, billowing musicians playing harps on deck, the sun reflecting off water. Cleopatra standing calmly at the center of it all, untouchable. The dinner that disarmed, a General Cleopatra hosted Antony on the barge for dinner. No politics, no begging, no fear. Instead, wit, intelligence, confidence, stories of Egypt's history, wealth, culture, perfect hospitality. Antony expected a submissive client queen. He found an equal. He was used to women flirting with him. Cleopatra did something far more powerful. She made him curious. 2 worlds collide. Let's be clear, Antony was no fool. He was a brilliant commander and skilled politician. But he was also impulsive, passionate, and deeply human. And Cleopatra? She was everything Rome wasn't. Warm instead of cold, elegant instead of brutal, mysterious instead of predictable, emotionally intelligent instead of paranoid. With Caesar, Cleopatra built power through logic. With Antony, she built power through chemistry. Not romantic chemistry, political chemistry. They fit. He understood armies. She understood economies. He led men in war. She held a nation together in peace. He had force. She had vision. Together, they could balance Rome and Egypt in a way no one had before. The deal behind the laughter, the banquets, the silk and wine, there were clear negotiations. Antony needed money ships supplies, a stable Egypt to anchor his eastern campaigns. Cleopatra needed protection, recognition, return of territories Egypt had lost, an ally to counter Roman aggression. They agreed. And then they became more than allies. Was it love? Possibly. Was it strategy? Absolutely. Was it convenient? Perfectly. Cleopatra returns to Egypt, with Rome at her side. After Tarsus, Cleopatra sailed back to Alexandria. Antony followed shortly after. He didn't summon her anymore. He visited her city. And once again, Cleopatra transformed reality. Alexandria bloomed like never before. Festivals, philosophy, gatherings, lavish banquets, cultural fusion between Greek, Egyptian, and Roman elites. People called it the inimitable life. A lifestyle so luxurious, so refined, so vibrant, it couldn't be replicated. But beneath the music and the moonlight, Cleopatra and Antony were planning, rebuilding, preparing. Rome thought Antony was being seduced. But if you looked closer, you'd see who was actually leading the dance. A queen in full power. For the first time since her rise to the throne, Cleopatra had a strong ally, a secure dynasty, control of Egypt's economy, loyal priests and officials, respect from foreign powers, the ability to choose her next move. She had survived betrayal, siege, and scandal. She had faced Rome twice and held her ground. Now, she was ready to build something bigger than defense. Not just survival, legacy. But the higher you rise, the more the world watches. And Rome was watching, especially one man, Octavian. Quiet, cold, calculating. A man who never forgot and never forgave. Chapter 7, Building a New Empire. Alexandria had seen power before. Pharaohs, conquerors, philosophers, but never anything quite like this. Cleopatra and Mark Antony ruled side by side, not as trophy and general, not as mistress and conqueror, but as partners. And for a brief, brilliant moment, it looked like they might actually reshape the world. Alexandria, capital of the East under Cleopatra and Antony, Alexandria became the unofficial capital of the Eastern Mediterranean. This city was unreal. The lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders, guiding ships from miles away. The library, vast and breathing with knowledge. Marble palaces overlooking the sea. Columns carved with stories of gods and kings. Streets alive with philosophers, traders, priests, soldiers, artists. And at the center of it all, a queen who understood both beauty and spreadsheets. Cleopatra didn't just host lavish banquets. She stabilized currency, improved taxation fairness, funded temple restorations, built shipyards, reopened trade routes. While Rome was busy stabbing each other in the Senate, Cleopatra was running a functional country. Antony in Egypt. And Antony? He was thriving in a very I finally met someone smarter than me way. With Cleopatra, He relaxed. He laughed. He debated philosophy. He actually listened. He wasn't just a Roman war machine. He became human. But don't be fooled. Antony wasn't whipped. He was invested. He saw what Rome could never give him: vision, sophistication, legacy. Cleopatra gave him more than love. She gave him purpose beyond war. The children of two worlds. Together they had 3 children: Alexander Helios, sun; Cleopatra, Selene, moon; Ptolemy, Philadelphus. Even their names were symbolic: sun and moon, a cosmic balance, east and west united. Cleopatra wasn't just building a family. She was building a dynasty that could outlive Rome. And if you think that sounds threatening, you're starting to understand why Octavian began to sweat. Antony's Parthian problem. But there was a challenge. Always a challenge. Rome had a long-standing enemy to the east: Parthia, modern-day Iran, Iraq. Think of Parthia as the one empire Rome kept trying to beat and kept regretting. Antony wanted to do what Julius Caesar did in Gaul: conquer, conquer, conquer. He dreamed of glory, of triumph, of wiping out Rome's deepest humiliation. The Roman legions lost to Parthia years earlier. Who funded this massive military campaign? Not Rome, Cleopatra. She supplied money, grain ships, horses, intelligence networks. Yes, Egypt bankrolled Rome's war. Again. Because Cleopatra thought long-term: if Antony wins, Egypt becomes untouchable. The campaign does not go as planned. Antony marched 100,000 men into Parthia, and Parthia said, "Cool. Ever tried fighting in a hostile desert, thousands of miles from supply lines, against mounted archers who can shoot backwards while galloping at full speed? Roman legions? Parthian archers. Good luck!" Fush, fush, fush. Antony lost tens of thousands of men. No glory, no conquest, just pain and sand. He returned to Alexandria, exhausted and humiliated. Cleopatra's response: did Cleopatra yell at him? Blame him? Abandon him? No, she welcomed him home with honor. Lavish ceremony, public respect, open arms. She understood something Rome never did. Support in defeat is more powerful than praise in victory. This is why generals, soldiers, nobles, everyone admired her. She didn't rule through fear. She ruled through loyalty. The donations of Alexandria. Then came the moment that changed everything. In 34 BCE, Cleopatra and Antony held a spectacular event in Alexandria: the donations. In a massive ceremony, before the people, they divided eastern territories and gave them to Cleopatra and her children. Caesarion was declared King of Kings. Cleopatra was declared Queen of Kings. Their children were given kingdoms across the east. This wasn't just pageantry. This was the blueprint for a new empire, one not ruled from Rome. Antony wasn't just a Roman general anymore. He was aligning himself with a new dynasty, Cleopatra's dynasty. Rome loses its mind. Octavian took one look at this and said, "Oh, they've lost their tiny royal minds." And then he got very, very strategic. He knew the Roman people wouldn't care if Antony fought wars, or spent money, or even had children with Cleopatra. But Rome would care about one thing: a foreign queen stealing Roman power. Octavian began the greatest propaganda campaign in ancient history. Posters, speeches, coins, poems, gossip. Antony is bewitched. Cleopatra wants to rule Rome. He's giving Roman land to her children. He's abandoning his Roman wife. He calls himself a god in Egypt. He drinks too much. Okay, that one was actually true. Antony was no longer a rival general. He was a traitor controlled by a temptress. Cleopatra was no longer a queen. She was the villain of Rome itself, and the people believed it. Because fear is easy to sell. and Octavian was the best salesman Rome ever produced. The storm gathers back in Alexandria. The air was still warm and sweet. Lanterns glowed along the streets. The Nile flowed undisturbed beneath the moon. But there was a heaviness now, a tension beneath the music and silk. Cleopatra and Antony had built something extraordinary, a partnership, a dynasty, a vision. But in the West, Octavian was sharpening a knife, and he only needed one target, Cleopatra, because if he could destroy her, Antony would fall, and Rome would belong to him. Chapter 8. The Propaganda. War and the Road to Actium. The most dangerous wars are not fought with swords, they're fought with stories. And Octavian was a master storyteller. While Antony and Cleopatra ruled the East with wealth, culture, and vision, Octavian sat in Rome crafting something even more powerful than armies, a narrative. Octavian's genius, weaponizing perception. He knew the Roman people didn't care about foreign borders or Eastern politics, but they did care about Roman identity, Roman pride, Roman masculinity, Roman superiority over barbarians. So Octavian's message was simple and brilliant. Mark Antony has betrayed Rome because of her. He painted Cleopatra as a seductive witch, a foreign invader, a threat to Roman values, a woman who used luxury and sex to corrupt Roman men. He painted Antony as weak drunk, slave to Cleopatra, traitor to the Republic, and the Roman public ate it up like freshly baked propaganda bread. How he sold the lie. Octavian unleashed everything. Coins showing Cleopatra as a serpent or monster. Speeches, Antony will move the capital to Alexandria. Rumors, Cleopatra wants to sit in the Senate. Poems and plays, mocking Antony as Cleopatra's puppet accusations. He has abandoned his Roman wife. Important note, his Roman wife was Octavian's sister. This was personal. The masterstroke. Then Octavian did something genius. He discovered Antony's will, possibly forged, possibly exaggerated. Doesn't matter. In it, Antony allegedly gave Roman land to Cleopatra's children, requested to be buried in Alexandria, not Rome. Recognized Caesarion as Caesar's true heir. This last point, nuclear. Because if Caesarion was legitimate, Octavian was nobody. So he twisted the narrative. Antony wants Cleopatra's son to rule Rome. The Senate flipped their tables. The people boiled with rage. Antony wanted a political alliance. Octavian gave him a holy war, declaration of war, but not on Antony. Here's the brilliance. The Senate did not declare war on Antony. They declared war on Cleopatra, a foreign monarch, a woman, an outsider, an easy villain. This allowed Octavian to say, this is not a civil war. This is Rome defending itself from an Eastern threat. Yes, Romans invented political spin. Antony and Cleopatra prepare back in Alexandria. Cleopatra and Antony saw the storm coming. Did they run? No, they built a navy, a massive, terrifying, expensive navy. Why the sea? Because Cleopatra was a master of logistics. Control the Mediterranean, control grain routes, starve Rome, and if Rome starves, Rome surrenders. Antony's fatal flaw. Antony had brilliant commanders, but he also had pride. He wanted one big, glorious, decisive victory, the kind you write poems about. Cleopatra wanted a long, flexible, strategic war, the kind you actually win. Antony listened to his ego, not his partner, and that mistake would cost everything. The calm before the collision. In 32 BCE, the combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra sailed to Greece and anchored at Actium, a narrow bay surrounded by hills and open sea. It was a risky position. but Antony believed his larger ships would dominate. Cleopatra brought 200-plus warships, massive supplies Egypt's treasury, her personal command. She wasn't hiding in Egypt. She was all in. Their navy glittered on the water. Their encampments stretched along the coast. Their flags merged Roman and Egyptian symbols. It was not just an army, it was a statement of unity. The world held its breath. Rome arrives. Octavian sent his greatest weapon, Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, a naval genius, cold, disciplined, relentless, not flashy, not romantic, not dramatic, deadly. Agrippa didn't rush into battle. He cut off Antony's supply lines. He captured coastal bases. He starved them slowly. Antony's camp grew weaker. Disease spread. Food dwindled. Morale faded. Some Roman allies defected overnight because Rome was very good at bribing people to reconsider their loyalty. Tension in the camp. Inside Antony and Cleopatra's command tent, arguments sparked like flint. Antony's Roman officers demanded a decisive naval battle. Cleopatra recommended retreat to Egypt to regroup and fight on land. Antony was torn. He respected Cleopatra's mind, but he feared losing face in front of his men. Ego versus strategy. Antony chose ego. The night before. Imagine the shoreline at dusk, the water still, the sky purple and gold, ships floating like silent beasts, tents glowing with lantern light. Antony walked the camp, trying to project confidence. Soldiers saluted, but their eyes were tired. Cleopatra sat in her pavilion, studying maps by torchlight. She could feel history tightening around them like a closed fist. If you stood beside her, you'd notice the quiet. No panic, no fear. Just calculation. She knew something Antony did not. If tomorrow goes wrong, Egypt must still survive. The battle is coming. The world's greatest queen. Rome's most famous general. History's most consequential war of perception. And tomorrow, everything would break. Not just armies, reputations, loyalties, empires, legacies. Some battles decide land. This one would decide how history itself would be written. Forever. And Cleopatra was about to discover that losing a battle is not the same as losing a war. Chapter 9. Actium. The battle they lied about, September 2nd, 31st BCE. The sun rose over the Ionian Sea like it didn't know it was about to watch history crack in half. The water was calm. The wind was gentle. It was, inconveniently, a beautiful day for war. On one side, Antony and Cleopatra with a massive fleet, rich resources, and the experience of countless campaigns. On the other, Octavian, with fewer ships, but one massive advantage, a naval genius named Agrippa, who treated strategy like an art form and patience like a weapon. The truth about the fleets. Roman propaganda later said Antony and Cleopatra were just drinking wine and making bad decisions. Reality? Their fleet was terrifying. Giant, heavily armored warships, towers mounted on decks, archers, marines, artillery, Egyptian engineers modifying ships for ramming and boarding Cleopatra's personal treasury funding. Everything. They weren't incompetent. They were prepared, but Agrippa wasn't going to fight them head-on. He'd already cut off their supply lines, captured key ports, forced them into a narrow bay where maneuvering was difficult. He didn't need to beat them in battle. He just needed to force a bad decision. The plan that never happened. Cleopatra's strategy was brilliant. Withdraw to Egypt, regroup, force Rome into unfamiliar territory, fight on land where Antony dominates. Smart, right? Antony agreed, in theory. But his Roman officers? Absolutely not. They demanded a glorious victory now, because honor, survival, a classic Roman philosophy. Antony ignored Cleopatra's long game. He chose pride, And Cleopatra let him. She knew something crucial. If I force him, I lose him. If I support him, I can still save this, in my own way. She didn't surrender control. She adapted, because Cleopatra's greatest weapon wasn't her navy. It was her ability to pivot. Battle begins morning. Both fleets move into position. Antony's heavy ships form a line. Cleopatra's squadron waits in reserve at the rear. Octavian's ships, lighter and faster, stay just out of range, frustrating Antony's men. Hours pass. Tension coils. Then Agrippa strikes the flanks. Antony's left line buckles. Ships collide. Arrows darken the sky. The sea erupts into chaos. The Battle of Actium was not a clean clash. It was a slow, grinding storm of fire, splintered wood, and screams. The decision that shaped history. In the middle of the chaos, Cleopatra makes her move. She sees the trap. She sees Antony's line collapsing. She sees the future, and she executes a predetermined breakout maneuver. This is important. She did not panic. She did not flee randomly. Her squadron opened sails, caught the wind, and cut through the fighting with precision, a perfect naval escape. Antony saw her moving, and in that moment, he understood the strategy. Save the fleet, save the treasury, save the dynasty. He followed her, not because he was bewitched, because he realized, far too late, that she was right. Their core squadrons escaped south. The rest of Antony's fleet, leaderless and surrounded, surrendered over the next day. Rome's favorite lie. Roman historians later wrote, Cleopatra fled like a coward, and Antony abandoned his men out of love. Cute story. Very dramatic. Completely false. The truth? Cleopatra preserved the treasury, shipbuilding capacity, and command staff, the backbone of any future defense. Antony chose to protect the only remaining strategic assets. They didn't run from the battle. They ran to save the war. Because a smart retreat is not defeat. It's survival. The cost. But survival came with a price. For the first time, Antony's reputation shattered. His men felt abandoned. Allies reconsidered their loyalties. Rome celebrated. And Octavian? He didn't relax for a second. He knew Antony and Cleopatra were still dangerous. They still had Egypt. They still had wealth. They still had influence. But now, for the first time, they were on the defensive, and Antony had lost something far more valuable than ships, the illusion of Roman invincibility. The sail home. Imagine their return to Egypt, the sea stretching endlessly ahead, the wind cold, silence heavy. No fanfare, no music, no cheering crowds, just two rulers standing on the deck, surrounded by loyal ships, knowing the next chapter would be the hardest. Sometimes, Cleopatra stood alone at the stern, watching the horizon, the water below dark and deep, the future even deeper. If you were beside her, you'd feel the quiet resolve in her heartbeat. She wasn't defeated. She was recalculating. Antony looked tired. She looked focused. One had lost his pride. The other had not lost her vision. The world reacts. News of Actium spread like wildfire. In Rome, celebration, relief, smug poetry. In the East, fear, uncertainty, silence. Some allies fled. Some waited. Some prayed. And in Alexandria, Cleopatra prepared. Because Cleopatra understood something Octavian didn't. Actium was not the end. It was the beginning of the final test. Egypt was still rich. Her navy still existed. Her people still loyal. Her will still unbroken. And Octavian would have to come to her homeland to finish this. And Egypt does not forgive invaders. But before swords, there would be something even more dangerous. Politics. The final act of their story was about to begin. And Cleopatra was not done fighting. Not by a long shot. Chapter 10. The last stand in Alexandria. The sea had taken their fleet. Rome had taken their reputation. But Cleopatra and Antony still had one thing left. Alexandria. Alexandria was more than a city. It was a statement, a jewel of marble and knowledge, a symbol of what civilization could be at its best. If Rome was iron and discipline, Alexandria was light and mind. And Cleopatra was its heart, the retreat home. When Antony and Cleopatra returned from Actium, there were no parades, no celebrations, just quiet, heavy, watchful quiet. The people lined the streets, not to cheer, but to understand. Were they safe? Were their rulers still strong? Would Egypt survive? Cleopatra didn't give speeches. She gave order. She immediately rebuilt defenses, repaired ships, reorganized the treasury, met with priests, strengthened loyalty among nobles, secured grain reserves, opened negotiations with neighboring kingdoms. While Antony drowned in shame, Cleopatra built a plan. Antony unravels. Antony was a soldier without momentum, a general without victory, a Roman without Rome. The same Antony who once inspired legions with a glance, now walked the palace halls like a shadow of himself. He feasted, he drank, he tried to forget, because he understood something terrible. Rome no longer feared him. And for a Roman, that is death. Cleopatra saw him fading, not as a lover only, but as an ally, a piece on the board, a human being crushed by failure. Did she blame him? No. She tried to revive him, gave him titles, ceremonies, purpose. But she also began preparing for a world after Antony. Octavian makes his move back in Rome. Octavian smelled blood in the water. He didn't rush to Egypt with an army. No. He did something far more Roman. He declared Antony an enemy of the state, and Cleopatra the true threat. Rome cheered. Then Octavian did the most Roman thing imaginable. He took his time. For a year, he raised money, built ships, spread propaganda, bought loyalty, quietly erased anyone who disagreed with him. By the time he sailed, the war was already won in the minds of Rome. Antony and Cleopatra were no longer leaders. They were villains in a story Octavian had already written. Antony's last legends. Antony had a few loyal commanders left. Not many, but the bravest. They promised to build a new army in Egypt. They promised to defend Alexandria to the death. And Cleopatra? She financed it all. Every soldier fed, every weapon forged, every horse supplied by her treasury. But soldiers are not fools. They could feel Rome's power closing in. They could see Antony's hesitation, and slowly, painfully, they began to desert. Not all, but enough. Even the bravest army crumbles when the future feels already decided. Trust and tension. Inside the palace, the atmosphere thickened. Some nights, Cleopatra stood in her private chambers, looking out over the city. The lamps flickered in the streets like constellations fallen to earth. The sea whispered against the shore. She had always been calm in crisis, but now she felt the walls closing in. Not panic, not fear, just the weight of inevitability. If you stood beside her, you might feel that same pressure, like history itself was holding its breath. A chance at peace. Cleopatra tried diplomacy one last time. She sent envoys, she offered tribute, she offered withdrawal. She even offered to abdicate if Egypt could remain free. Octavian refused. He didn't want peace. He wanted the narrative. I didn't conquer Egypt. Egypt surrendered to me. He wanted Cleopatra alive, paraded in chains in Rome, humiliated before the people, so he could prove that no one defied him and survived. He didn't just want her kingdom, he wanted her image. Because if he broke Cleopatra in public, he would become unstoppable. The sand begins to slip. Tension between Antony and Cleopatra grew. Some say she withheld support. Some say he suspected betrayal. The truth, they were both cornered animals, wounded, proud, exhausted. One night, Cleopatra tested poisons on condemned prisoners, not out of cruelty, out of preparation. She needed to know. What is quick? What is painless? What leaves the body untouched? Because she understood Octavian's plan. Better to die as a queen than live as a trophy. The last hope breaks. Antony attempted one final battle, one last chance to redeem himself. His cavalry charged Octavian's forces outside Alexandria, and many immediately defected to Octavian. Imagine that moment. You ride into battle with men you've led for decades, and they turn their horses to the other side before swords even clash. Antony staggered back to the city, broken, a god of war, with no followers. His lowest moment, Antony believed Cleopatra had betrayed him. Some say a false report was delivered to him. Cleopatra is dead. The world tilted. He had lost battles. He had lost Rome. But losing her, that was the final blow. So Antony did what tragic heroes do. He fell on his sword. But fate wasn't done with him. He didn't die. Bleeding, he was carried to Cleopatra. The final embrace. Cleopatra had locked herself in her mausoleum, a stone fortress filled with gold and treasure, her final safeguard. When she saw Antony, wounded and dying, she had him lifted up to her window and brought inside. They say she held him in her arms as he took his final breath. History makes it romantic. It was also political. He died in her custody, in her arms, in Egyptian territory. Even in death, Cleopatra controlled the narrative. Outside, Alexandria held its breath. Inside, the queen prepared for the end. Rome was coming. Octavian was close. But Cleopatra still had one move left, one final act of sovereignty, and she would choose it herself. Chapter 11, The Last Queen versus the First Emperor. Antony was dead, but the war was not over. Because the war was never just about armies. It was about narratives. Antony had lost his. Cleopatra refused to lose hers. The City of Silence. After Antony's death, Alexandria did something extraordinary. It went quiet. No riots, no rebellion, no mass panic. Why? Because the people were watching their queen, and Cleopatra was calm. She dressed in mourning. She secured the palace. She spoke softly to her children. She continued to rule, even with death at her door. There is a specific kind of power in composure. Rome had legions. Cleopatra had presence. Octavian enters. When Octavian finally marched into Alexandria, he expected chaos. Instead, he found a city still standing, dignified. He expected resistance. Instead, the gates opened. He expected to chase Cleopatra through hidden tunnels. Instead, she sat on her throne, waiting. Octavian was many things: cold, brilliant, ruthless, but even he had to respect this. She was beaten, but she was not broken, and he hated it because he didn't want a queen. He wanted a symbol of submission. Egypt falls. But not yet. Cleopatra Octavian took control of the city with surgical precision. He disarmed the guards, took the treasury, seized the harbor, placed Cleopatra under guard in her own palace. Then he made his intentions crystal clear. He would take Cleopatra to Rome alive, parade her in chains in his triumph, and display her before the Roman people as proof that he had conquered the East. She would become a living souvenir, a political trophy, a cautionary tale, and Cleopatra, who had been worshipped as Isis, who ruled an empire, who spoke with kings and scholars and gods, would be dragged through Rome like an animal. No crown, no dignity, no legacy, just humiliation. Cleopatra's last negotiation. But Cleopatra was not done playing this game. She met with Octavian, and she didn't beg. She negotiated. She said, "Egypt will submit peacefully. The people will not rebel. The treasury will be yours. But spare my children." This was her final act as queen. Protect the dynasty. Octavian listened. He nodded. He promised mercy. But Octavian had the eyes of a snake, and Cleopatra saw it. Promise or not, he would kill her sons the moment he no longer needed them. Why? Because Caesarion, her eldest, was the biological son of Julius Caesar, meaning he had a stronger blood claim to Rome than Octavian himself. And Octavian didn't share thrones. The internal battle. Cleopatra returned to her private chambers. She dismissed her servants. She sat alone, and she faced the one decision no history book can make for her. Live or die. Living meant chains, humiliation, watching her children die, watching Octavian rewrite her life. Dying meant control. For the first time since childhood, Cleopatra could not outthink the situation. She couldn't bribe it. She couldn't charm it. She couldn't politically maneuver it. Rome wasn't playing chess. Rome was flipping the board. So, she chose differently. She chose to become myth. The mausoleum Cleopatra ordered her mausoleum prepared. The tomb she had designed herself. Filled with gold, jewels, symbols of power, gifts to the gods. A resting place fit not just for a queen, but for a statement. She had one last meeting with Octavian, pretending she was preparing to depart for Rome. He left satisfied. He had no idea. She was about to disappear from his control forever. The legendary end. The details are debated. Some say an ASB, Egyptian cobra, was smuggled in a basket of figs. Others say she used a poisoned ointment applied to her skin. Some suggest a small needle, a discreet toxin. The method doesn't matter. What matters is this. Cleopatra chose her death. She died as she lived, in royal clothing, in her mausoleum, with her attendants by her side, on her own terms, not as Octavian's trophy, not as Rome's entertainment, but as Egypt's final sovereign. The aftermath. When Octavian found out, he was furious, not because she died, but because she stole his victory image. He wanted to show the world a broken queen. Instead, the world saw a legend. Her body lay in state. The people wept. Even Romans were moved. Antony and Cleopatra were buried together by Octavian's order. Why? Because even he knew their story was bigger than his anger. The fate of her children. Octavian spared Cleopatra's children, except one. Caesarion, her firstborn, the son of Julius Caesar, was quietly executed. Octavian famously said, "Two Caesars are one too many." The daughters were raised in Rome. One of them, Cleopatra Selene, would go on to become a queen in her own right. Even in death, Cleopatra's bloodline endured. The birth of an empire. With Cleopatra gone, Octavian took Egypt as his personal property, not Rome's his. He returned to Rome a hero. He became Augustus, the first Roman emperor. The Republic died. The empire was born. And ironically, Rome didn't conquer Egypt. Cleopatra's death gave Rome the excuse to crown an emperor. She didn't just witness the end of an era. She triggered the beginning of the next one. Rome's final insult. Over the years, Roman writers dragged her name through the mud. Seductress, manipulator, witch, foreign threat. They needed her to be the villain, so Octavian could be the savior. They wrote history, they controlled the story, and they thought they had won. But they underestimated one thing: myths outlive propaganda. And so, the legend began. In the soft silence of her mausoleum, beneath the stone and gold, Cleopatra left the world with one last truth. You can steal my kingdom. You can erase my name from your monuments. But you will never control how the world remembers me. Because the world does not remember who Rome tells it to remember. It remembers those who burn bright enough to be seen across centuries. And Cleopatra still glows. Chapter 12. What remains? The war was over. The queen was gone. Egypt had bowed to Rome. But legacies don't die when bodies do. They linger, in memory, in myth, in the quiet spaces history can't quite erase. When Cleopatra died, the ancient world felt a shift, not just the loss of a ruler, but the end of something sacred. For over 3,000 years, Egypt had been governed by its own monarchs. Pharaohs, god-kings, dynasties that rose and fell within its own borders. Cleopatra was the last. With her death, Egypt didn't just lose independence, it lost an identity. It became Rome's province. Its grain fed Roman citizens. Its temples became tourist attractions. Its gods became curiosities. Its language slowly faded from the elite. A civilization once seen as eternal became a possession. But not everything was lost. Cleopatra's enemies thought they buried her. Instead, they planted her. Her story survived in whispers, in plays, in poems, in art. Even when Roman historians tried to paint her as a monster, they couldn't hide her brilliance. She kept Egypt stable for 21 years, longer than most Roman leaders survived. She spoke more languages than any ruler of her time. She balanced diplomacy with economics, tradition with innovation. She wasn't just the lover of Caesar or the tempter of Antony. She outmaneuvered both. Even in defeat, she held the world's attention. Rome conquered her kingdom, but they never conquered her mystique. Her bloodline continued. They killed Caesarion, but they didn't kill her daughter, Cleopatra Selene. Rome sent her to live with Octavia, Octavian's sister, Antony's Roman wife. It's messy, I know. Roman family trees come with warning labels. But Cleopatra Selene survived. She grew, learned, adapted. She even married a North African king and ruled beside him. Her coins show her wearing an Egyptian-style crown, little echoes of her mother, alive in the art of another land. Cleopatra's blood didn't disappear. It traveled, it transformed, it endured. The woman behind the legend. Who was Cleopatra, really? Not the caricature Rome described, not the fantasy Hollywood sells. She was a ruler in a man's world who refused to apologize for existing, a strategist in a world of soldiers who often outplayed them, a polyglot in a world of arrogance who understood her people, a mother who tried to carve out a future for her children, a symbol of resistance against a rising empire. A woman who lived on her own terms and chose to die on them. She was not perfect. She could be ruthless. She made mistakes. She gambled and sometimes lost. But she never, ever let the world define her. And that is why we still speak her name. The myth that outlived empires, Rome became an empire. It expanded. It glorified itself in marble and blood. And then it crumbled. But Cleopatra, her story remained. not as Rome told it, but as humanity felt it. She became a symbol of female power, a warning about propaganda, a reminder that history is written by the loudest, not the truest, and quietly, a comforting truth. Greatness is not obedience to power. Greatness is defiance in the face of it. If you walk today along the Alexandrian coast, the waves still touch the land she once ruled. The ruins of palaces sleep beneath the water. The lighthouse is gone, but its foundation remains. Fragments of her world, waiting. And if you listen closely, beneath the tide, beneath the centuries, you can almost hear her voice. I was more than they said, and I still am. The night returns to the Nile. The night settles over the river again, soft as a sigh. The stars hang above Egypt just as they did in Cleopatra's time, unmoved, eternal, patient witnesses to the rise and fall of empires. The Nile glides silently through the darkness, carrying memories within its endless flow of queens and conquerors, alliances and betrayals, love and strategy, beginnings and ends. And somewhere along its banks, history still remembers a woman who refused to be small. Cleopatra, the last pharaoh, the last voice of a civilization, the ruler who stood against the greatest empire the world had ever seen, and even in defeat, kept her dignity. She could not save her kingdom, but she saved her legacy, and perhaps that is a different kind of victory. Because tonight, centuries later, with the world quiet and your eyes growing heavy, you are still listening to her story. And as long as her story is told, Cleopatra still reigns. Thank you for traveling through time. Rest now as the Nile drifts gently beneath the moonlight. History will keep watch. Good night.